Hi, I'm Jonathan Hafitz, and welcome to Law on Film, a podcast that looks at law through film and film through law. This episode, we look at Inglourious Basterds from 2007, written and directed by Quentin Tarantino, which revolves around two plots to assassinate Nazi leadership during the closing years of World War II. One plot centers on a secret band of Jewish American soldiers under the command of Lieutenant Aldo Raine, played by Brad Pitt, the so-called Bastards, who terrorize Nazis. The other plot involves Shosanna Dreyfus, played by Melanie Laurent, a young Jewish woman who narrowly escapes death at the hands of notorious Jew hunter Hans Landa, the Christoph Waltz character, and flees to Paris, where she runs a cinema under a false identity. The plot lines converge in the Paris cinema, where the Bastards and Shosanna are each separately plotting to kill Hitler and the other Nazi leaders who were in attendance of the premiere of a German propaganda film. By engaging in alternate history to spin a tale of revenge, the film explores the complex themes around different ways of obtaining justice against the Nazis and those who commit mass atrocities. Joining me to talk about Inglourious Basterds is Renana Keydar. Renana Keydar is an assistant professor of law and digital humanities at the Hebrew University, where she is also academic director of the Center for Digital Humanities and heads the Alfred Landecker Lab for the computational analysis of Holocaust testimonies. Professor Keydar is the recipient of the prestigious Elan Fellowship for Outstanding Young Researchers. She holds an LLB in law and a BA in political science from Tel Aviv University and a doctorate in comparative literature from Stanford University. Professor Keydar was a postdoctoral fellow in the Minerva Center for Human Rights and a research fellow in the Martin Buber Society of Fellows at the Hebrew University. She also previously served as a legal advocate in the Israeli State Attorney's Office, High Court of Justice Department. Among her numerous publications, Professor Keydar is the author of Lessons in Humanity, Reevaluating International Criminal Law's Narrative of Progress in the Post 9/11 Era, which uses Inglourious Basterds to explore a range of issues surrounding international criminal justice. Professor Keydar, Renana, welcome to Law on Film.
Hi, thank you very much for having me, Jonathan.
So, what prompted you to write about Inglourious Basterds in a journal of international law?
Wow, that was the end of a long journey that I took with Quentin Tarantino and his movie. When I first saw the film, what struck me as the most interesting about it is how it plays with counter history, with counterfactual history. For me, that was really what struck my initial interest in the film. And when I was writing my thesis, my dissertation on conceptions of justice in post-atrocity situations, I was thinking about how the movie is a prime example of reimagining what justice could have looked like. And when I was, trying to formalize it more in academic terms, I realized that the movie, of course, inadvertently, or, I don't think that Quentin Tarantino went into law school thinking about that or anything, but the movie, in a way, portrays a counter narrative, not only to what happened in 1944 or 1945, which is when the movie takes place, the plot of the film, but also to the entire arc of justice as we imagine it from the Nuremberg Tribunal onwards.
Okay, and so that arc, right, and you refer to that, and it's referred to in the academic literature as a progress narrative, right? And that's the narrative in modern international criminal law that often starts with the Nuremberg Tribunal after World War II, right? And it continues up today. So what is the progress narrative and how does it function in international law?
Well, if we start from 1945, 1944 even, when the discussions on how to prosecute the Nazis after, when already the Allied forces were imagining the end of World War II, when they saw the progress after the invasion of Normandy and everything, and they're starting to play around with the idea of what will they do with the Nazis, and how will they prosecute them, how will they in fact achieve justice, not so much for the Holocaust, but mostly for the crimes of aggressive war during World War II. And, the different topics that came out, the different solutions that were thought of, I won't go into the whole discussion, much has been written about it, was anything from summary executions, just, put them against the wall and shoot them all, something that was, thought about also by prominent officials in the Allied forces, all the way to really inventing this kind of a very different notion of justice that I would call in my writing the Enlightenment justice, justice as enlightenment. let's take them to court. Let's teach them what they did wrong. Let's teach humanity how barbarous was the behavior of the Nazis and how we as society, as humanity can move forward. So from the get-go, the entire premise of the Nuremberg Tribunal was about educating a new generation of people, of humanity, about being better, doing better. And part of this was to put the Nazis in their suits, in their uniforms, in the courtroom, giving them their day in the courtroom. And they, sure did got their day. If anyone remembers Hermann Goering's speech, I mean, it was his interrogation by the Allied forces, by the prosecutor. But if anyone remembers that or wants to look back at it, that was a complete act of performance by Goering, who was anyway, revered as the, very glorious bastard, if you. So we see that this is the narrative that propels the entire Nuremberg endeavor, and since then onward, entire criminal law endeavor, international criminal law endeavor, is about achieving this kind of, I want to say progress, but more achieving these moments of enlightenment, of teaching humanity how to become better after events of mass atrocity.
And so I'll play right now a clip from U.S. Chief Prosecutor and U.S. Associate Justice Robert H. Jackson's opening statement tribunal, which quote in the article, very famous, which I think encapsulates this idea.
The privilege of opening the first trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored, because it cannot survive their being repeated. That four great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason.
And so in your article, you describe, this journey from Jackson's historic opening statement to the Basterds' imagined call for arms 7 decades later in the film as a journey from a moral rhetoric that rejects acts of revenge as an official response to unimaginable crimes to what you call state actions and their popular perception that indicate a turn away from this narrative of progress in favor of vengeful policies. Here's Aldo Raine's opening speech to the Basterds about putting together a team.
My name is Lieutenant Aldo Raine, and I'm putting together a special team, and I need me 8 soldiers. 8 Jewish American soldiers. Now, y'all might have heard rumors about the Armada happening soon. Well, we'll be leaving a little earlier. We're going to be dropped into France, dressed as civilians. Once we're in enemy territory, as a bushwhacking guerrilla army, we're going to be doing one thing and one thing only: killing Nazis. Now, I don't know about y'all, but I sure as hell didn't come down from the goddamn Smoky Mountains, cross 5,000 miles of water, fight my way through half of Sicily, and jump out of a fucking airplane to teach the Nazis lessons in humanity. Nazi ain't got no humanity. They're the foot soldiers of a Jew-hating, mass-murdering maniac, and they need to be destroyed. That's why any and every sumbitch we find wearing a Nazi uniform, they're gonna die. Now, I'm the direct descendant of the mountain man Jim Bridger. That means I got a little engine in me. And our battle plan will be that of an Apache resistance. We will be cruel to the Germans. And through our cruelty, they will know who we are. And they will find the evidence of our cruelty in the disemboweled, dismembered, and disfigured bodies of their brothers we leave behind us. And the German won't be able to help themselves. But imagine the cruelty their brothers endured at our hands, and our boot heels, and the edge of our knives. And the German will be sickened by us. And the German will talk about us. And the German will fear us. And when the German closes their eyes at night and they're tortured by their subconscious for the evil they have done, it will be with thoughts of us that they are tortured with. Sound good?
Yes, sir!
That's what I like to hear. But I got a word of warning for all you would-be warriors. When you join my command, you take on debit. A debit you owe me, personally. Each and every man under my command owes me 100 Nazi scalps. And I want my scalps. And all y'all will get me 100 Nazi scalps, taken from the heads of 100 dead Nazis. Or you will die trying.
So how do we get from Jackson, Robert H. Jackson, to Aldo Raine?
Yeah, so from stay the hand of vengeance to let's kill them all. Yes, I think for me, that was the question with which I started this, in a way, this inquiry. What happened? What happened to us? And I think the answer is both historical and psychological. Not that I'm in psychology, but, in the psychology of narratives, let's say. And on one level, we see that the entire effort of the Americans, of Justice Jackson as the chief prosecutor, the chief American prosecutor, is to banish away any, not even sentiment of revenge, but even the implication of revenge. Justice Jackson, or Prosecutor Jackson, is doing everything he can to rid the trials of any such emotions and sentiments of revenge. So the concept of enlightenment is not only in the level of the type of justice we want to achieve, but also in the procedural way of achieving it. It meant not bringing in the Jewish voice, not bringing in oral testimonies in general. In the entire Nuremberg tribunal, there were just as much oral testimonies as in the Eichmann trial 15 years later, which was a much, in a way, smaller trial of one, culprit, as against to, the 22 perpetrators, 24, 22, depends how you count them, at the Nuremberg tribunal. So we see here that Chief Prosecutor Jackson is doing everything he can to keep the trial very, very rational. So stay the hand of vengeance is not just in the type of punishment that we will meet on our perpetrators. It's also by the way that we will achieve this kind of justice. And for me, that was one layer of not acknowledging even very human reason, a wish or will to revenge against those that really committed unprecedented crimes, and completely pushing this away from the legal stage, but also from the rhetorical international arena, was a very acute act, a very premeditated act of banishment that I wanted to draw attention to the prices it had. So that's, if you want, on the more psychological narrative level. On the more practical historical level, if you want, what we see when we look at Aldo Raine and his speech, of course, it's situated in 1944, 1945, but it's in a way a kind of a counter history or alternative history to what actually happened, gives us a different track of history that you cannot disassociate from the moment in which the film actually is produced and being filmed, which is post 9/11. So you have here this historical moment in which we ask, did we actually manage to rid ourselves of revenge? So, did major enterprise of international criminal law of saying we are better than the barbarians, we do things differently, we don't shoot them against the wall, we, take them to court, give them nice outfits and give them, their day of justice, do we actually do that? And when the film, is being produced and being broadcast, we're still hunting for Osama bin Laden. And then, a few years later, the US armies catch him and they don't bring him to justice. We all know what happened to Osama bin Laden. We know what they tell us that happened to Osama bin Laden. So I think it was a very interesting moment in which to ask, did we succeed in the narrative of, enlightenment and progress?
Yeah, it's so interesting because you look at, as you say, if you go back to when it was made, 2007, right, the height of global war on terror, you have targeted killing you have Guantanamo, you have torture, right? At the same time, you also have the rise and development and maturation of international criminal justice institutions. By this time, you have a permanent international criminal court, which is sort of, in some ways, the ultimate fulfillment of the Nuremberg ideal, flawed as it may be. And so it's interesting, you kind of have both of these things operating kind of at the same time.
Yeah, and in a way, if you want, that's the power. If we take for a second the more literary perspective, that's the power of alternative histories. They show us the path not taken, right? They show us, if you want, the shadow sentiments that lie under the official history. It's the alter ego of what we of our humankind psyche, the collective psyche. So we tell ourselves that we are not barbarians, that we go to court, that we are into progress and enlightenment, that the form of justice, we as humanity, and I'm well aware that I'm using this royal we, but imagined collective humanity that the Americans in a way have after 1945, when they imagined this new world order. And we in a way ask ourselves, are we so much better? And what Quentin Tarantino's movie is doing, in my mind, with its alternative history, is to tell us, you try to get rid of revenge, but it always lingers in the shadows. And even more than that, it gets to be much, front and center when you just let it enter the door. So it's both showing us what we didn't choose back then, but also how we can't really run away from it when we actually, confront our demons.
In the movie, there are sort of, I think, two scenes which you identify in your article that in particular highlight this sort of theme of revenge. So the first one, a little smaller scale, is the brutal execution of this German officer, Sergeant Werner Rockman, by one of the bastards, Sergeant Donnie Donowitz, played by Eli Roth, referred to as the, quote, Bear Jew, who's ordered by Aldo Raine to effectively bash in this German officer's skull with a baseball bat after the officer refuses to disclose basically what's actionable intelligence about the location of German troops in the vicinity. So then Aldo Raine kind of sets the stage for this. So what's significant about this scene that you write about?
Well, it's nice that you say sets the stage, because it's actually the performative act that happens there, right? They're all sitting around, and there is the immediate reference to the fun of enjoy of going to the cinema, both within the text and, of course, in the wink for the audience, us that sit and watch Quentin Tarantino's bloody, gory plot. I think what's interesting here is the unapologetic use of violence, sheer violence, the joy of violence. And of course, when you couple it with the fact that this is the Bear Jew, and it's worth noting, Aldo Raine is not a Jew. It's not about Jewish revenge. He's a Southerner. He's, leading this group of Americans, but some of them are Jews. And the Bear Jew, Eli Roth, the role that Eli Roth plays, is, of course, symbolizing Jewishness, American Jewishness. Of course, you don't have to go far to think about the Jewish American with the baseball bat and everything, all these insinuations and implications. And you just see here just sheer violence for the sake of enjoying violence. And that's something that we weren't allowed to enjoy or talk about politically and, culturally. And of course, that's the stuff that, the kind of violence that Quentin Tarantino always plays with in his movies. But here, situating it within the alternative reality of World War II, it really, sheds some light on the things that we do, but we do not agree to tell about. Again, when you take it to post 9/11, we already see how these are the things that we do tell, and we do them and we tell them. Israel has a long history of, thinking about its policy with tortures. There was a big Supreme Court decision about, banning the use of torture, and everybody knows that still, nonetheless, these investigation techniques in certain circumstances do go on. So everything is always like spoken and unspoken. And I think that it was very much the same in post 9/11 US, with the Guantanamo and everything, and interrogation techniques and all these key, buzzwords that came to control our discourse. And what Tarantino is doing is just putting it out there, telling us we enjoy violence, we deserve violence. that is our pleasure, violence, and it's the Jewish soldiers that will meet this violence. And for me, it's a very powerful, confrontation with our, inner desires.
And the other scene that you highlight, and this is effectively the film's climax, interesting, also occurs in the cinema, right? So the reference to film. This depicts the killing of Hitler and the other Nazi leaders, as well as a large civilian crowd in the Paris cinema. Shosanna and her assistant, and who's also her lover, as well as several bastards, also die there. So here's the clip of when Shosanna's image suddenly appears on the screen that had been showing the German propaganda film just before she sets the cinema on fire.
Who wants to send a message to Germany?
I have a message from Germany. That you are all going to die.
Schloss! Aus!
Projekt raus!
And I want you to look deep into the face of the Jew who is going to do it.
Untröstlich, ich weiß nicht, was hier los ist. Das gehört nicht dazu.
Oui, Shosanna.
Shosanna Dreyfus. And this is the face of Jewish conscience.
So what messages and themes do you draw from this very violent and very memorable scene?
Well, that's a really, really powerful scene in which you see really basically Hitler being gunned down, ending in a way like a piece of Swiss cheese, all held up and in a very close up to his face and Shosanna's face. You can do a lot. I mean, that's really the geniusity of Tarantino, putting so much into these rather basic violent symbols. And you can really take it to several directions. What I took from it again relates to this kind of a counterfactual history. Hitler was never caught, right? He committed suicide. Now you can play with your conspiratorial imaginations. Did he die? Didn't he not die? Maybe he continued to live in the jungles of South America. We don't know. But, as much as we know as the common knowledge, he killed himself. And we didn't get, and I'm saying it, of course, now very provocatively, we didn't get the joy of killing him, of executing him. And in a way, the movie wants us both to acknowledge that we would have all liked to kill him and really give us the satisfaction of really tapping into our very, very basic emotions of we want this bastard dead. And that's a very powerful emotion to reckon with, that what we want is to kill our enemies, not to put them in a courtroom, not to send them to fancy jails, but to really just massacre them. And when we are seeing this movie, when Osama bin Laden has not been caught and killed yet, but, there is already the poster of the dead or alive that, George W. Bush is, as a president, is publicizing this kind of a wanted poster. We already see the transgression or, reversal from this narrative of 1944, 1945. We're not going to shoot them, no summary executions. We are going to take them to court. And we see in real life, as the movie plays in the cinema, also the political agenda, the political atmosphere changing around what do we want to do to our enemies. So in a way, it's a counterfactual, but also a very strong representation of reality at the same time. And for me, that was what you sit and you enjoy this, this killing, very violent, animalistic killing of Hitler, while knowing that we didn't get to do that, but maybe we will get to do it with another kind of a Hitler in a way. Yes, of course, I'm not comparing and everything is different, but, indeed, several years later, we did somehow manage to get the kick out of, killing an arch enemy. It's also maybe, Jonathan, worth reminding that this is all a replay of what happened in a way in the Nuremberg Tribunal, where, again, if we go back to Goering, Hitler, of course, was not indicted or tried in the Nuremberg Tribunal. He was already dead. But Goering is the most prominent Nazi criminal on stage. And again, after humiliating in a way in his investigation, the chief prosecutor, the final blow of humiliation is that he commits suicide on the evening of his planned execution. So the court gives him the death verdict, the death sentence, and he's supposed to be executed. And the night before, he kills himself with a capsule of cyanide that he somehow finds its way to his jail cell. So again, the sense of humiliation is because we didn't get a chance to kill our enemy, whether by legal means, the death sentence, or by just, plain violence.
To go back, I'm thinking of that moment when, after bin Laden's killed by the US, Obama appears on television, kind of very somber, very serious, very matter of fact. And it's interesting because you can argue this is right, the revenge killing, but it's stripped of all the joy or the celebration, if you will, right, that Tarantino explores in his movie. And, I'm not saying it's hypocritical, but to some extent it might be sort of the hypocrisy is the tribute that vice plays to virtue, right? There's no celebration, we got him. It's just very matter of fact. So even when you have this maybe operation of this revenge, it's sort of sanitized in some respect.
Of course, and I think that's the tension that we always face. That's what, in a way, Goering told the Americans or the Allied forces when he was on trial. History is written by the victors, in a way. So the victors in this case were the Americans or the Navy SEALs or whoever you want to put as the winners here, that, in a way, assassinated or killed during action Osama bin Laden. But we are better. We don't celebrate the death of our enemies. But in a way, that's what happened that day, right? We all, in a way, were happy that this guy that was in charge of, really the biggest, catastrophe on American U.S. soil, that he got what he deserved, right? For me, what's strong about Tarantino is that he forces us through the movie to face these primal emotions that we have. Now, I want to make it very clear. I do not argue that revenge needs to be part of our arsenal of legal tools. We invented, long time ago, humanity invented the courtrooms in order to avoid an eye for an eye. It's okay that the legal system works this way. I am against the death penalty, and it's not part of this conversation, but that's my private position. And I can argue again why it's immoral and illegal and all that. But that doesn't preclude the fact that we need to acknowledge that we are missing revenge sometimes as humanity, again. And I think that the split that took place in 1945, where the legal system takes care of all emotions post-atrocity, is being dismantled very, smartly and cunningly by Tarantino in his movie, making us very well aware of what makes us happy about the fall of our enemies. And, in the right moment in time where we were actually also doing things that are along these lines of revenge.
Yeah, and so to be, as you say in your article, I guess, aware of what you call this blind spot, not to embrace it, but to be aware of that. We talk about alternative endings, in which you mentioned Tarantino uses in other films. He comes back to alternative endings again in 2012 in Django Unchained, deal with race and slavery. And then in 2019, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, the Sharon Tate murders by the Manson family. And so these types of alternative histories, they're adjacent or in tension with the progress narrative, but ultimately the vision of justice at some level is something that everyone is rooting for. It's just maybe the method, right? How you get there is different. But there are also alternative histories about this era, the World War II era, which have a very different ending. I'm thinking of Philip Roth's novel, The Plot Against America, a later basis for the 2020 HBO miniseries, which depicts the political rise of Charles Lindbergh and the takeover of America by fascists. So I want to talk about the role of those type of alternative histories, which, are relevant to think about as well.
Of course. So, it's Hannah Arendt, the Jewish philosopher, thinker, has a beautiful saying about alternative history, that it only goes to show that the main idea of alternative history is to show us the indeterminants of history, that what happened did not contingently had to happen. And I find it very beautiful because I think that's the strength of any counter narrative. It goes to remind us that history is not predetermined. History is something that is being made by human decisions. And human decisions can always take a different, path. So when we chose to put the Nazis on trial, it was that was a choice by the Americans that were, had the upper hand at the end of World War II. It could have happened otherwise. Maybe if the Soviets were stronger, then there would be just summary executions and that's it. I don't know. That's the power of playing with counter narratives. And in a way, Philip Roth, and of course also The Man in High Castle and other narratives that imagine the defeat of America or the different track that America could have taken in 1945 or during World War II. The power of that is to remind us maybe of the dangers that still lurk if we don't pay enough attention, if we don't pay enough attention to our blind spots, to our emotions, to our suppressions, if we believe that we are more enlightened than we are actually. Because when we were saying before, this counter narrative is supposed to show us our blind spots, I want to add something to that. It's not just to show us our blind spots. It's also to let us understand a bit better the price that we paid for our decisions, for the decisions that were made. The decision to put the Nazis in the courtroom had many good implications. It was, as you said, heralded the international criminal law, modern international criminal law. That's great. But it also had some other implications that we don't often take into account. For example, that revenge will explode at some point, for example, post 9/11. So when we look at something like the Plot Against America, Philip Roth, Plot Against America, I don't see it as disconnected from the imagined reality of Quentin Tarantino. I see them as very much connected in the sense that they both, in a way, try to shed light on what we suppressed, on the things that we didn't want to admit that we might be like them in a way, whether it's more violent than we think we are, more primitive, if you want, or barbaric than we think we are. Maybe it's more fascist than we think we are. So I think that's the power of these alternatives in a way that they let us know that history is only what we make of it as humans. And so we have to work very hard every day to make the right choices. That's the ethics of that, right? That every day we need to make the right choices.
As this is Tarantino, right? This is also about film itself, Inglourious Basterds. We talked a little bit about like the climax with Shosanna Dreyfus cutting in, her image cutting into the cinema before she lights it on fire. And then we also see there's another scene in the film towards the middle where this British officer, Archie Hickox, Michael Fassbender, brilliant in the movie, who's also an expert on German film, being briefed by General Edward Finneck, played by Mike Myers, on Operation Kino, which is the plot to kill Hitler and other top German leaders at the cinema. And so this then leads into a discussion of film and the use of film by Nazi chief propagandist Joseph Goebbels, played by Sylvester Groth. So here's a discussion about film in Nazi Germany.
Are you familiar with German cinema under the...
Yes, obviously I haven't seen any of the films made in the last 3 years, but I'm familiar with it.
Explain it to me.
Pardon, sir?
This little escapade of ours requires a knowledge of the German film industry under the Third Reich. Explain to me Ufa under Goebbels.
Goebbels considers the films he's making to be the beginning of a new era in German cinema, an alternative to what he considers the Jewish German intellectual cinema of the 20s and the Jewish-controlled dogma of Hollywood.
How's he doing?
Frightfully sorry, sir. Once again?
You say he wants to take on the Jews at their own game. Well, compared to, say, Louis B. Mayer. How's he doing?
Quite well, actually. Since Goebbels has taken over, film attendance has steadily risen in Germany over the last 8 years. But Louis B. Mayer wouldn't be Goebbels' proper opposite number. I believe Goebbels sees himself closer to David O. Selznick.
Brief him.
Lieutenant Hickox, at this point in time, I'd like to brief you on Operation Keydar.
So what role did film and film propaganda play in Nazi Germany, and what, if anything, was Tarantino suggesting about film through the reference, in this case, just the major Hollywood studio heads?
Oh, okay. That's a highly explosive. Well, let's start with the role of cinema for the Nazis. I mean, that's really a huge topic, and much has been written about it, from Leni Riefenstahl's contributions to many others. Many propaganda movies were made, and when I say propaganda movies, you have those that are labeled as propaganda movies and are what we call the reserved movies today. So you're not allowed to show them in classes or in any public viewings unless you get a special permission from a special office, as the German bureaucracy likes. But then you have many other movies from that period that serve the same propaganda of anti-Semitism, of the grandeur of Nazi regime, that are not directly propagandic, but they still portray the same tropes of the Jewish cunningness and all these tropes that we know about German cinema of that era, and they are still being shown. So some of them, of course, and I think it tells us something both about the power of movies that were used both by fascists and by other fractions to really set the spirit and the agenda of the people, to make them prepared, or to train them in the way that the regime wants. And of course, we can think about what, maybe I don't want to hurt Tarantino, but maybe what replaces the role of cinema in today's public discourse as the propaganda. But that's really, in a way, a very strong allusion to the power of cinema at the hand of the Nazis, at least, or of dictators in general. Tarantino loves to play with cinema. He's a cinephilic. That's his entire career. He's just a lover of cinema, and everything he does is intertextuality with movies that really, I mean, if you read his latest writings on the cinema, it's really a love song to cinema and all its references and things that really only he knows, but he doesn't care. That's his major mission. Why does he allude to, what does it say about Hollywood heads, and how much did they know about the Holocaust, and how much did they collaborate? Well, that's a huge question. Yeah, it's a huge question that should be investigated more. Have been investigated, should be investigated, but the complacency is always, the most difficult question.
Yeah, I mean, it's also, I think, Tarantino, when he says, he thinks, is he more, Selznick or Louis B. Mayer, right? The Fassbender character says he's more David O. Selznick, right? I mean, a lot of it, I think, is just Tarantino just going down rabbit holes. But I think the larger point that you make about film and the power of film, a lot happens through film in the movie.
Yeah, it's a film inside a film inside a film. So they watch one film, The Pride of the Nation, and in this film there is another. So intercut into that is Shosanna's Space, which is a film in and of itself. There are so many references here. I mean, you just sit and enjoy the Tarantino show in a way, and you accept it on its own terms.
So the film is fictional, but there was a secret British unit known as the X Troop, which was organized by Churchill, who was in favor of more vengeance after World War II and not the trial, right? But anyway, which consisted of Jewish refugees from Germany and Eastern Europe who collected information about and fought on the front lines against the Nazis. So any thoughts about this group as we're talking about the film?
So, it's not, there were several of these kind of organizations. There was also an organization called Nakam, which is literally revenge, or to venge, that was led by Abba Kovner, who was one of the partisan leaders, partisan heads, and later gave testimony in the Eichmann trial, a very lengthy testimony. A lot of it was propaganda for the partisan groups. And they also tried their way revenging the Holocaust. What is very important to say is that there wasn't much place or desire for vengeance by the government, at least. One of the things that become very clear when Eichmann is caught and brought to Israel from Argentina in this very famous Mossad operation, 15 years after the Nuremberg Tribunal, is the pride that the Israeli society, in a way, has in not being vengeful. And that's really an interesting question, because unlike maybe the Jewish Americans or the Americans in general, Israel is the nation of the survivors. They are the ones who lost everything to the Nazis. And what you see in 1960, in 1961, in the public discourse around the Eichmann trial is a very strong sentiment that correlates or corresponds to this narrative of progress, of we are better. So we are going to put Eichmann on trial. We are going to do it in a court of law, by the law, in a very fair and procedural, fair way. And that's going to be our revenge. I mean, that's what Ben-Gurion, the Israeli prime minister, that's what he says. Our revenge is the establishment of the state of Israel and its court system. That will put Eichmann on trial. And for me, that's interesting because we're not talking about something that happened 70 years after the Holocaust. That's 15 years after the Holocaust. Survivors are, filling Israel. And still you manage to get this very strong and stubborn narrative of progress in a way that shows you maybe the strength or the success of the Nuremberg Tribunal, so you can light up your imagination with groups like, the X group or the Nakam group. But at the end, they were very, very minor, almost eccentric examples that did not succeed, by the way, also. What you do get is the dominance of the narrative of progress that really took hold even within the young, the nascent Israeli country, Israel state.
And you see also the progress, I guess this goes a little bit off topic, but how a lot of the energy for subsequent tribunals starts to fade. You get a lot of Nazis come back into power, ex-Nazis, right, not the top leadership, but others. This happens in Japan with the Tokyo Tribunal as well. It doesn't have that much staying power. I mean, if you look at a movie like Judgment at Nuremberg, where they talk about this, and by the you really see those are compromises that start being made as time goes on.
I mean, of course, politics enter into play, and you have the Cold War starting. So there are bigger moves to take into account. It's not just around narratives of justice. I wish it was. It would have made my dissertation very powerful, maybe. But we do see, while the Cold War takes over, and we don't see anymore these endeavors of justice. By the way, it's not completely true because the Eichmann trial does take place during this kind of period of the Cold War. And it does offer this kind of a moment of narrative of justice and progress, but it doesn't count so much within the longer arc of international criminal law for other reasons. I can go into that, but I think that deserves a different podcast already. But you do see this as kind of a moment. But again, you see how international criminal law ties back or taps back into the narrative of progress the moment it can. So 1990, with the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Empire, you see the rise of, again, this, picking up where they left off in 1945 of the narrative of justice, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda and for Yugoslavia that are really facing and confronting horrendous crimes, genocide and mass killings and ethnic cleansing, and the strength of the choices that were made in 1945, you see how strongly they hold because there's no newer discussion in 1990. When they build this court, it's already based on the discussions that were made in 1945. No one is now asking, should we or shouldn't we put them on trial or summarily execute them? No, that discussion was already made. So it's true that the Cold War put a damp on everything, several decades, long, bloody decades. But when the time is right, the narrative of progress just awaits there to being picked up and immediately takes hold, takes prominence. So it's a very interesting arc to look at. History is not written in decades, it's written in centuries. And you see here that after half a century of really sinking into the blood and gore of the Cold War, there is a room for the rise again of this narrative of justice, of enlightened justice.
Any final thoughts on the film Inglourious Basterds?
Well, I have to say that one of the scenes I love the most is really the ultimate scene, where they carve the swastika on the head of the main perpetrator, the Nazi hunter, the Nazi perpetrator. And in a way, that's the epitomizing revenge. That goes back to the most biblical moment, making him the sign of Cain and telling him no matter what happens on the global stage, on the political stage, you may get amnesty, you may be, as you just said, you may even be, get your American citizenship and be acknowledged as a fine citizen and everything. We don't care about that. We will inflict this kind sign on you, so no one will be mistaken. And for me, that's a very lucid moment of private, primal revenge that no politics can take away, from the bastards. And there's something in it that, really, you carve it with the knife and now you twist the knife and tell politics and history, it doesn't matter what you do. This man, at least, is marked. We won't be mistaken with him. And for me, it's a very nice moment of really showing us all the levels of vengeance that we can, explore and enjoy in a way.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned that scene. I mean, it is such a memorable, like a kind of coda to the film, right? And Christoph Waltz, right, who's so key to the movie, I think. Hans Landa, right? He's at the opening when they go into the farmhouse where Shosanna and her family are hiding. He's the one that ruthlessly, ferrets out that the person who owns the house has, the Jewish family in the basement, has them all shot. She manages to get away. But at the end, right, he cuts himself this deal, he knows what's happening. And so he's going to escape essentially, right? But it's exactly right. Aldo Raine says, you're not going to get away with this. And it's personal. He says, Christopher Waltz says, you're not allowed to do this. And Aldo Raine says, maybe I'll get chewed out a little bit, but nothing's going to really happen to me. I've been chewed out before. And it's exactly what you said, this sort of moment of kind of private vengeance. He'll be marked for life, right? He may be able to go and live in, it's Nantucket or somewhere in New England where Christopher Waltz's character wants to go, but he's going to have this mark upon him.
Yeah, and I think that's really also, narrative-wise, it really, we said already that the two plots converge in the cinema, but here really the plot has a closure, right? Because it starts with something that Shosanna and her private pursuit of vengeance that does not reach a closure in the sense that she's dead before she knows what happened to all the other criminals. And now it's like this final last revenge that really closes the film, closes the two plots. I want to say something else. As I said, in 1961, when Eichmann is caught, Israel is not thrown into a wave of revenge. And that's telling. When Israel is thrown into the throes of revenge, is when people, Holocaust survivors, in the 1950s, start to identify their fellow inmates in a way, or fellow concentration camp couples in the streets of Israel, in the street in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, in Haifa. And that's when they demand revenge. And they go to the legislators, they go to the police, and they demand a law that will enable them, not to shoot the collaborators in a way, but to put them on trial. And you see here how the public and the personal all really melt together in a way. And I think this kind of this personal need for closure vis-a-vis those that personally hurt you is very, very strong, both in real life and in the cinema. So that's why this scene, is very powerful to me.
Well, Renana, I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast and talking about Inglourious Basterds and international justice and all of these themes around narratives of progress and their limitations.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for having me. It's always a pleasure to speak to you and definitely to speak about Tarantino.